They broke into her pool every night, laughing, partying, and ignoring her warnings. Until one night, the water wasn't what they expected, and their screams said it all. The summer nights were supposed to be peaceful, but for Mrs. Jenkins, they had become a nightmare. A retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, she had worked hard all her life to afford a quiet home with a beautiful backyard, a backyard that included a pristine swimming pool. It was her little oasis, a place where she could relax, sip sweet tea, and enjoy the warm breeze. But lately, that peace had been shattered. At first, she had noticed footprints on the wet pavement in the morning, the faint scent of chlorine lingering in the air. Then came the trash, empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and even discarded fast food wrappers scattered around the poolside. It didn't take long for her to realize what was happening. A group of local teens had claimed her pool as their own. Every night, after she went to bed, they would sneak in, laughing and splashing as if they had paid for the luxury. They had no regard for the fact that it was her home, her sanctuary. Worse, they didn't seem to care. One evening she confronted them. As the sun set, she stepped outside, wrapped in her robe, her voice calm but firm. "This is private property," she had warned. "I don't know who raised you to think this is okay, but I need you to leave." The teens, lounging in her chairs as if they owned the place, barely looked at her. One of them, a tall boy with a cocky smirk, shrugged. "Chill, lady. We're not hurting anyone." Another one chuckled, swirling his feet in the water. "Yeah, it's just a pool. Not like you even use it." Their arrogance was infuriating. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't a weak woman, but she also wasn't about to start a fight with a group of disrespectful kids. Instead, she called the police, hoping the presence of authority would put an end to the problem. It didn't. By the time the cops arrived, the teens were gone, like ghosts, vanishing into the night. And the officers? They weren't much help either. "Unless you catch them in the act, ma'am, there's not much we can do," one had told her, offering an apologetic shrug. Mrs. Jenkins felt powerless. Night after night, they returned, each time bolder than before. She heard them laughing at her from behind the fence, mocking her complaints. But they had underestimated her, because Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just going to sit back and take it. One evening, as she watched them from her darkened window, an idea began to form. If they refused to listen, she would make sure that the next time they jumped into her pool, they'd regret it instantly. Mrs. Jenkins had tried everything: warnings, police calls, even installing extra locks on the gate. But nothing stopped them. They came back night after night, growing more confident, more reckless. It was no longer just about sneaking into the pool. It was about defying her, mocking her. One evening, as she sat by her window, watching the silhouettes of the teenagers climbing over her fence yet again, she felt something shift inside her. Enough was enough. If they refused to listen, if they thought they could invade her space without consequence, then she would teach them a lesson they would never forget. She spent the next afternoon preparing. A special mixture, completely harmless but highly effective, was poured into the water. She stirred it carefully, watching the clear blue surface ripple under the sunlight. From the outside, it looked the same as always: inviting, cool, safe. But when the time came, when those arrogant kids leaped into her pool once more, they would realize far too late that something was different. That night, she turned off all the lights, creating the perfect illusion that she had gone to bed early. She left the back door slightly ajar, an unspoken invitation. Then, she waited. Right on schedule, they came. She could hear them before she saw them: whispers, laughter, the rustling of bushes as they scaled her fence like cockroaches. The moonlight cast shadows against the pavement as they crept toward the pool, their voices hushed but tinged with excitement. "Told you she wouldn't do anything." One of them snickered. "Old lady's probably asleep." Another one yawned, stretching his arms. "Whatever. Let's just get in." And then they jumped. For a few seconds, everything was normal. Splashes echoed through the air, followed by satisfied sighs as they sank into the water. But then it started. The first scream cut through the night like a knife. "What the hell?" Another one followed, higher pitched, more frantic. "Dude, what is this? My skin!" Panic spread like wildfire. They thrashed, trying to climb out of the pool, but the sensation followed them. Their skin tingled, then burned, not painfully, but enough to make their bodies itch like fire. They clawed at themselves, their laughter turning into desperate gasps. What the fuck did she put in here? Mrs. Jenkins stepped onto her porch then, her figure framed by the dim glow of her house lights. She didn't yell. She didn't rush. She just stood there, watching. The teens scrambled to get out of the pool, slipping on the wet tiles as they fought to escape. One of them, the cocky boy who had told her to chill the first time, glared up at her, his face contorted in anger. "You crazy old hag. What did you do?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Oh, nothing dangerous," she mused, her voice deceptively sweet. "Just a harmless little chemical reaction. Baking soda, a bit of salt, and some harmless dye. But it does tend to irritate the skin if you stay in too long." That's when they noticed. Their skin. Under the dim lighting, they hadn't realized it at first, but now, under the glow of her porch light, they could see. Patches of bright neon green stains covering their arms, their faces, their clothes. It wouldn't wash off easily. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. One of the girls gasped, looking at her reflection in the pool's surface. "Oh my God, I look like a freaking alien." The realization hit them all at once. Their night of fun had turned into a nightmare. Tomorrow, when they went to school, when they walked down the street, everyone would know. Mrs. Jenkins let the silence linger before delivering her final blow. "You see," she said, crossing her arms, "that's a special kind of dye, completely non-toxic, but it sticks to the oils on your skin. It'll take about a week to fade." She smiled, not cruelly, but knowingly. "So, I'd suggest you tell your parents exactly why you look like glow-in-the-dark monsters before they start asking questions." The group stared at her, horrified. They had played their game for weeks, taunting her, ignoring her warnings. But now? Now the joke was on them. No more sneaking in, no more laughter at her expense. They had trespassed into her space for the last time. The silence that followed was thick with shock. The teenagers stood frozen, their wet clothes clinging to their bodies, their hands still rubbing furiously at the neon green patches staining their skin. Their once cocky, defiant expressions had been replaced with sheer horror. "You're lying," one of them muttered, staring at his glowing reflection in the pool. His hands trembled as he tried to scrub the color away, but it only made it worse. The neon stains spread like a curse, sinking deeper into his skin. Mrs. Jenkins didn't say a word. She simply stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching them scramble like rats caught in a trap. "We need to get this off. Now!" A girl shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. She sprinted to the garden hose and turned the faucet on full blast, shoving her hands under the freezing stream of water. But as the minutes passed, her breathing grew more erratic. Nothing was changing. The others followed suit, clawing at their skin, rubbing themselves raw against their soaked t-shirts, desperately trying to erase the evidence of their trespassing. But the more they scrubbed, the more they realized. Mrs. Jenkins had not been bluffing. One of the boys, the same one who had laughed in her face just days ago, turned to her now, his arrogance completely shattered. "What did you do to us?" His voice, once filled with confidence, now quivered with something dangerously close to fear. She tilted her head slightly, her face unreadable. "I already told you, dear. It's completely harmless." She let the words sink in before delivering her final blow. "It just sticks to the oils in your skin. You know, the kind that keeps you from looking like a dried-up prune. Should take about a week to fade. Maybe 2. A week. The weight of that reality hit them all at once. The boys exchanged frantic looks, their minds racing through the implications. Tomorrow was Monday. They would have to go to school, to practice, to their jobs. And now, there was no hiding it. "This isn't happening. This isn't fecking happening." One of them hissed, gripping his hair. Another boy, the one who had arrogantly called the pool just a pool, was pacing now, his breathing uneven. "We have to go to the hospital or something. Maybe they can—" "Oh, sure," Mrs. Jenkins interrupted, a slow smile creeping onto her lips. "Tell the doctors exactly how you ended up like this. I'm sure they'd love to hear all about your late-night swims." That stopped them in their tracks, because she was right. There was no way to explain this without confessing. No way to beg for help without admitting they had trespassed onto private property, night after night. For the first time, they were trapped. But there was still one who hadn't spoken. The leader. The tall boy with the cocky smirk that had vanished the second he saw his reflection. He had been standing in silence, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. And then, suddenly, he snapped. "Screw this." His voice was low, cold. He turned toward Mrs. Jenkins, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. "You think you're funny? You think you can mess with us?" The others tensed, watching as he took another step, his wet sneakers slapping against the pavement. "I should burn your damn house down for this." Mrs. Jenkins didn't move. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. Not the kind of smile you'd expect from an old woman facing down a furious teenage boy. This was different, because it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of warning. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice so calm it was terrifying. "You think I wasn't prepared for that?" And then, the motion sensor lights flicked on. All at once, the backyard was bathed in a bright, unforgiving glow. But that wasn't what made the teens freeze. It was the security cameras. 4 of them. Mounted on the corners of her house, their red recording lights blinking steadily. The leader's face twisted into something ugly. "You." "That's right," Mrs. Jenkins said, cutting him off. She took a single step forward, just enough to let the porch light catch her eyes. "I have everything, every single night, recorded, in full color, with sound." Silence. Cold, suffocating silence. She let the tension build, let them stew in their own growing panic before she delivered the final crushing blow. "Now, I was just going to let you walk away. Let you deal with your little skin problem and hope you'd finally learned your lesson." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. "But if you want to threaten me?" She pulled out her phone, and in one smooth motion, she opened the app that connected to her cameras. On the screen, clear as day, was footage from the last few nights. The teenagers jumping the fence, laughing, splashing in the pool like it was theirs to take. "Say the word," she murmured, "and I'll send this to the police. Let's see how your parents like getting that call in the middle of the night." And that was it. That was the moment the leader lost. His jaw clenched, His fists curled, but there was nothing he could do, nothing any of them could do, because Mrs. Jenkins had won. And as they stood there, humiliated, furious, glowing like neon freaks under the harsh backyard lights, one thing was certain: they would never come back. For the first time since they had started sneaking into her pool, they were truly afraid. The leader, once brimming with arrogance, now stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing through possibilities. He could lash out, he could try to argue, but nothing he said would change the fact that she had all the power now. The neon green stains were bad enough, but the security footage? That was a death sentence. "This is illegal," he finally spat, his voice sharp but unsteady. "You can't do this to us." Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, tilting her phone slightly so the screen reflected the damning footage. She scrolled back, the glow of the screen illuminating her satisfied smirk. "Oh, but you can do this to me." He had no response. None of them did. Behind him, his friends were still desperately scrubbing at their skin, their movements growing more frantic as the reality of the situation set in. They couldn't hide this. Tomorrow their classmates would see it, their teachers, their parents. "What do you want?" one of the girls finally asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Jenkins took a slow step forward, letting the weight of her silence settle over them. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to threaten. She had already won. "I don't want anything," she said at last. "But you do. You want this to go away, don't you?" She let the words linger, watching as their desperation grew. "Then let me make something very clear." The porch light flickered slightly as she leaned against the railing, her voice carrying an edge sharper than any raised fist. "You will never set foot on my property again. You will never climb my fence, never touch my pool, never even look in the direction of my backyard." She let the weight of that sink in before adding, "Because the moment you do, this footage goes straight to the police. And trust me, boys, your parents will be far less forgiving than I am." Silence. Pure, suffocating silence. Then, without another word, the leader turned on his heel and stormed toward the fence. His movements were stiff, rigid with humiliation, but he didn't argue. He knew when he had lost. The others hesitated for just a moment longer before scrambling after him, their wet sneakers slapping against the pavement, their glowing green hands leaving faint, smeared trails along the wooden fence as they clawed their way out of her yard for the last time. Mrs. Jenkins stood there, watching them disappear into the night, their frantic whispers and hurried footsteps fading into the distance. And then she exhaled. The battle was over, and she had won. Slowly she turned back toward the pool, the once still water now rippling from the chaos of the past hour. A few discarded towels lay crumpled near the edge, abandoned in their haste to flee. She walked toward the pool, kneeling beside the water's edge. Her reflection wavered in the dim glow of the backyard light, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Mrs. Jenkins reached down, swirled her fingers through the water, watching the ripples spread outward. The dye had done its job, perfectly, and with that, she stood up, dusted off her hands, and walked inside, knowing she would never hear those voices in her backyard again. The next morning, the whole neighborhood was talking. Word spread fast in a small town, and when a group of teenagers showed up to school streaked in neon green, it didn't take long for people to start asking questions. Some laughed, pointing at their glowing arms, their still stained faces. Others whispered, sensing that something more humiliating had happened. The teens tried to downplay it. They said it was just a prank gone wrong. some harmless joke among friends. But Mrs. Jenkins knew better, because later that day, as she sat on her porch sipping her sweet tea, she saw them again. This time, walking home with their heads down, shoulders slumped, avoiding every glance thrown their way. They had been humiliated, not just by the die, but by the weight of their own actions catching up to them. And that wasn't even the worst of it. That evening, as the sun dipped low, a sleek black SUV pulled up outside her house. The leader's mother, a sharp-dressed woman with an expensive handbag and a glare that could cut glass. She stormed up to the porch, fury in her every step. Mrs. Jenkins didn't stand. She didn't need to. She just took another slow sip of her tea and waited. "You did something to my son," the woman hissed, voice dripping with entitlement. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, completely unfazed. "No, ma'am. Your son did something to himself." The woman sputtered, demanding explanations, threatening legal action. But when Mrs. Jenkins pulled out her phone, ready to play the footage for her right there on the porch, the fight drained from her eyes. She knew. She knew her son had trespassed. She knew he had mocked and disrespected an elderly woman. And she knew, if that footage got out, there would be no defending him. "Make sure it doesn't happen again," Mrs. Jenkins said simply, setting her glass down with a quiet clink. The woman's jaw tightened, her pride warring with her understanding that she had already lost. She said nothing as she turned sharply and stormed back to her car. As the SUV disappeared down the road, Mrs. Jenkins smiled. Because tonight, for the first time in weeks, she would sleep soundly, knowing they would never come back. That night, Mrs. Jenkins sat by her pool, the water still and calm once more. The moon reflected off its surface, undisturbed, peaceful, exactly as it should be. She let out a slow breath, feeling a sense of satisfaction settle deep in her bones. Not just because she had won, but because she had done it without raising her voice, without threats, without lowering herself to their level. She had simply let them trap themselves in their own arrogance. A week passed, then another, and just as she expected, they never came back. No more laughter outside her window, no more footprints by the water, just silence. One afternoon, she caught sight of the leader's mother again, this time at the grocery store. Their eyes met across the aisle. The woman hesitated, pride still evident in the tightness of her jaw, but after a moment, she gave a small nod. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement. A silent understanding that Mrs. Jenkins had been right all along. Mrs. Jenkins just smiled and moved on. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. And sometimes, the best lessons aren't taught with anger. They're taught with patience, intelligence, and just a little bit of creativity. So, what do you think? Did Mrs. Jenkins handle this the right way? Have you ever had to teach someone a lesson without saying a word? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Who knows? The next story might just be about you.